All right, get ready, because today we're going deep on something that can be pretty confusing even for big NFL fans, the NFL salary cap.
Yeah, it can definitely feel overwhelming.
But once we break it down, you'll start to see how teams can really get creative to make it all work. It's kind of like a whole other game happening behind the scenes.
Exactly.
And we've got some awesome sources today with a ton of real examples of how teams use all these contract tricks.
It's like signing bonuses and even something called void years. We'll definitely get into all of that.
I'm already intrigued, so let's just start with the basics. What exactly is the salary cap, and why is it even a thing in the NFL?
Well, simply put, it's a limit on the total amount of money each team can spend on player salaries for the season.
Okay, so I guess the idea is to keep things fair and prevent teams with a ton of money from just buying up all the best players.
Exactly. It's all about competitive balance.
Makes sense. But with all these huge contracts we hear about, how do teams even stay under this cap?
That's where the real strategy comes in. Teams have to get super creative with how they structure contracts, and sometimes it means making some tough choices.
I bet.
And we'll talk about specific examples later on, but you might have heard the term dead money before.
Oh, yeah, and the sources actually mentioned a pretty crazy example. The Denver Broncos and Russell Wilson. Something like $85 million in dead money.
Wow. Yeah, that is a lot.
I mean, is that some kind of record?
It's definitely up there.
So just to clarify for everyone, dead money is money a team still owes a player, even if they're no longer on the team.
Right. So in the Broncos case, they released Wilson, but they're still paying a portion of his salary because of how his contract was set up.
So it's like a financial hangover from a deal that didn't really work out.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it really shows why teams need to be so careful about negotiating contracts and guaranteed money.
Definitely a cautionary tale for any NFL general manager. So, okay, we've got this idea of the salary cap, and we know dead money can be a big issue. But what about the actual parts of a contract?
Yeah.
How do those affect the salary cap?
So you've got things like signing bonuses, roster bonuses, all sorts of bonuses.
Right. Our sources mention a whole bunch of them. Can you give us a quick rundown of what these all mean?
Sure. A player's base salary is probably the simplest to understand. It's just their yearly pay. But then you have signing bonuses, which are paid up front in a lump sum.
Okay.
But the interesting thing is they count against the salary cap over the entire length of the contract.
So it's like teams can use those to lower a player's cap hit for the first few years of a deal.
Exactly. It's kind of like spreading out the cost over time.
Right, like paying off a house with a mortgage.
Yep, that's a good analogy. And then there are roster bonuses, which are paid only if the player is still on the roster on a specific date.
So teams could use those to encourage players to stay with the team or to maybe create some cap space.
Yeah, they definitely offer some flexibility.
I'm already seeing how teams have to be pretty creative with all this.
Oh, absolutely. And we haven't even touched on option bonuses or workout bonuses yet. There are a lot of tools in the toolbox.
It's getting pretty complex, but I can see how mastering all these techniques could give a team a huge advantage.
Oh, for sure. It's a constant balancing act. Teams are always trying to put together the best possible roster while staying under the cap. And it takes a really deep understanding of how all these different contract elements work together.
Well, speaking of getting creative with the cap, the sources also mentioned something called contract restructuring. What is that exactly? And why would a team want to do it?
Basically, a restructure lets teams convert some of a player's salary into a signing bonus. So it's kind of like we talked about before.
Okay.
This lowers their cap hit for the current year, but it does increase it in the future.
So it's kind of like kicking the can down the road, right?
Yeah, exactly. But of course, there's some risk involved too.
Yeah, it's just thinking that. Like, what happens if the player doesn't play well or gets injured?
Right, that higher cap hit in the future could become a big problem.
That makes sense.
And actually, the sources had a really good example of this using Joey Bosa's contract with the Chargers.
Oh, interesting.
They've restructured his deal a few times, which gave them some much-needed cap space in the short term. But it could come back to bite them later on.
Gotcha. It sounds like restructures are like a high-stakes gamble.
They definitely are. There's big potential for reward, but there's also a lot of risk involved. Teams need to be really strategic about when and how they use them.
Okay, so we've covered how teams can get creative with veteran contracts. But what about rookies? Are their contracts different?
Yeah, rookie contracts are a little different. They have a fixed length, 4 years for drafted players and 3 years for undrafted players.
Okay.
And the salaries are determined by where they were drafted.
So the higher a player is drafted, the more they'll make on their rookie deal. Makes sense.
Right. And that's why finding those hidden gems in the later rounds can be so valuable.
Because if a late-round pick turns out to be a star, they're essentially on a really cheap contract for their first few years.
Exactly. It gives teams a great player at a bargain price.
And that frees up cap space to spend on other players.
Right.
Now, I do remember something from the sources about first-round picks having a special option in their contracts, something about a fifth year.
Oh, yeah, that's right. First-round picks have a fifth-year option that gives teams the chance to keep them for an extra year beyond their initial 4-year contract.
Interesting.
And the salary for that fifth year is based on how well the player has performed and if they made the Pro Bowl.
So it's like teams can try to lock in a great player for an extra year, maybe at a bit of a discount.
Yeah, exactly. But they do have to decide after year 3 if they want to exercise that option.
And I'm guessing that decision can be tough.
It can be. If the player exceeded expectations, that fifth year can be a real steal.
But if the player hasn't played well or got injured,
then that fifth year could be a big financial burden.
Right, makes sense. And the sources actually highlighted some examples from the 2022 draft class, like Sauce Gardner and Aiden Hutchinson.
Oh, yeah, those are good ones.
Their potential fifth-year salaries would have been pretty different because Gardner made multiple Pro Bowls. And those differences can add up to millions of dollars, right?
Definitely. It's a lot of money for teams to consider. And remember, that fifth-year salary is fully guaranteed. So even if the player gets hurt or doesn't play well, the team still has to pay them.
So it's another one of those tough calls that NFL general managers have to make. But man, this is all fascinating stuff. I'm starting to see how the salary cap is like this whole other game happening behind the scenes.
It really is. And we're only scratching the surface. We still need to talk about things like void years and the proven performance escalator.
All right, well, I'm hooked. We've already covered so much, from dead money and signing bonuses to fifth-year options. It's amazing how much strategy goes into managing the NFL salary cap.
It really is. It's one of the most fascinating parts of the league.
And honestly, I'm eager to dive even deeper into it.
Me too. There's still so much to uncover.
So let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and keep exploring this wild world of NFL contracts and the salary cap.
Sounds good.
Welcome back, everyone. Before the break, we were talking about all these ways NFL teams can get creative with contracts to manage the salary cap.
Yeah, it's really like a whole other game happening behind the scenes. And one thing we haven't talked about yet are incentives, like performance-based bonuses.
Right. The sources mentioned something called likely to be earned and not likely to be earned incentives.
Yeah, those can be kind of tricky.
Can you explain those a bit more?
Sure. So think of them like bonuses that are tied to a player's performance. A likely to be earned incentive is for something a player has done consistently in the past.
Okay.
Like, let's say a running back has rushed for 1,000 yards every season for the last 3 years.
Okay, I'm following.
His contract could include a bonus for hitting that 1,000-yard mark again. And the key is that bonus counts against the salary cap this year, even if he hasn't reached it yet.
So the team is basically betting that he'll keep playing at that same high level.
Exactly. It's a calculated risk for sure. Now, a not likely to be earned incentive is for something the player hasn't done before.
Okay, so using that same running back example, maybe he's never scored 20 touchdowns in a season.
Right, so if his contract has a bonus for reaching that milestone, it wouldn't count against the cap until he actually does it.
Ah, that's interesting. So it's a way for teams to encourage players to reach new goals without immediately impacting their cap situation.
Yeah, exactly. It's a delicate balance for sure.
It is. And our sources actually gave a good example of this with Saquon Barkley's contract with the Eagles. He's got incentives in his contract tied to yardage, milestones, touchdowns, even winning the Super Bowl.
Wow, that's a lot riding on his performance.
Right. But I guess it just shows how complex these contract negotiations can be.
Absolutely. Both the player and the team are trying to get the best deal, but they also have to consider how the player might perform in the future. It's a lot to think about.
And speaking of the future, remember that big salary cap increase we were talking about earlier? I bet that would really change things.
Oh, for sure. A big cap jump would completely shake things up.
I mean, do you think with more money to spend, teams would be more likely to use those aggressive contract strategies like we were talking about? The restructures and void years?
Possibly, yeah. With a higher cap, teams might be more willing to take those risks, especially if they think it'll give them a better chance to win a Super Bowl.
So we could see teams pushing even more money into the future.
That's one possibility. But on the other hand, a higher cap could also mean more competition for free agents.
So salaries could go up even more.
Exactly. Teams would really have to be strategic about who they're willing to spend big on.
Right. And it makes me think about that article we discussed where it said playoff teams tend to restructure contracts more aggressively. I guess it makes sense. Those teams are really focused on winning now.
Yeah, they're definitely more willing to take those financial risks if they think it'll help them win a championship. But as we saw with the Broncos and Russell Wilson, sometimes those aggressive moves don't pay off.
True. It's a good reminder that there's no magic formula for building a winning team.
Right. It takes a combination of things, good drafting, smart contract decisions, and yeah, a bit of luck never hurts either.
Definitely. But speaking of contract stuff, I'm still a little confused about those void years we mentioned earlier.
Oh, right.
They sound kind of like science fiction. Like, how can a year exist but not really exist?
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's a bit of a brain teaser.
So can you walk us through how they actually work?
Yeah, so let's say a player has 2 years left on his contract.
Okay.
If the team adds 3 void years, they can basically spread out any signing bonus money over 5 years instead of just 2. This lowers the player's cap hit right now, but it does create dead money when those void years eventually hit.
So it's like delaying the inevitable.
Exactly. It gives the team some breathing room now, but they'll have to pay the price later on.
And the risk is that dead money can really build up if a team uses void years too much.
Right. It can limit their flexibility in the future.
I see. So void years, just like those restructures we were talking about, are a tool that can be helpful, but only if teams use them carefully.
Exactly. The key is understanding the risks and rewards that come with each of these contract techniques and using them strategically.
It's a lot for these general managers to think about.
It definitely is.
Hmm.
But it's also what makes the NFL so interesting. There's always another layer of strategy to uncover.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we've been breaking down this crazy world of the NFL salary cap.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We have. We've talked about how teams can use things like signing bonuses and void years to free up cap space.
Right, all those little tricks and maneuvers they use.
It's pretty clear that managing the salary cap is almost as important as managing the players on the field.
I completely agree. It really is a game within the game. And it's going to be so interesting to see how teams approach all this stuff in the offseason, especially with that big potential salary cap increase we've been talking about.
Right. That potential cap jump is the big question mark right now. It could really change everything.
For sure. I mean, teams might be more willing to spend big money on free agents if they know they'll have more room under the cap later on.
Makes sense. But they still have to be smart about it, right?
Absolutely. They can't just go crazy handing out massive contracts. Even with a higher cap, they still have to think about the long-term consequences.
Yeah, it's like suddenly having a ton of money, but you got to decide. Do you spend it all right away, or do you invest it wisely for the future?
That's a great analogy. And a team's situation plays a big part in that decision, too. A team that's close to winning a Super Bowl might be more willing to take risks and spend big right now.
Makes sense. They're in win-now mode.
Exactly. But a team that's still rebuilding might want to be more careful.
They're probably focused on building through the draft and developing young players on cheaper contracts.
Right. And then there are also the franchise tag and transition tag, which teams can use to keep key players from becoming free agents.
Oh, right. We haven't even talked about those yet.
Yeah, they give teams more control, but they come with a big price tag. So a higher cap could mean more teams using those tags.
Which would definitely affect the whole free agent market.
Exactly. It's like one change to the cap can have a ripple effect across the entire league.
It's all connected. This is getting complex. But can we back up for a second and just talk about why the salary cap is even necessary?
Oh, that's a great question. It's all about creating a more even playing field. It prevents those really rich teams from just buying up all the best players. And honestly, I think it makes the NFL more exciting for the fans.
Yeah, I agree. It forces teams to be smarter with their resources. It's not just about who has the most money anymore.
Right. It's about who can make the best decisions. And those decisions involve understanding contracts, managing the cap, and even predicting how the cap might change in the future.
It's a lot. So
Yeah.
let me ask you this. If you were an NFL general manager right now, what would be your top priority when it comes to the salary cap?
Well, I think it always starts with having a clear vision for your team. Who are your core players? How are you going to build around them? It's a balancing act. You need to reward your best players, but you also need to keep some flexibility to fill out the rest of your roster.
So it's about finding that balance between winning now and building for the future.
Absolutely. You don't want to sacrifice one for the other.
It's definitely a challenge, but I guess that's what makes it so interesting.
Exactly. The best general managers are the ones who can find creative ways to work within the salary cap and build a team that can compete for years to come.
Well said. Well, folks, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into the NFL salary cap.
It's been fun.
It has. We've explored all those complicated contract structures,
Yeah.
the strategy behind managing the cap, and we even talked about what could happen with that potential cap increase.
Hopefully everyone listening has a better understanding now of how important the salary cap is to the NFL.
I hope so, too. It really is like a whole other game going on behind the scenes, and it's constantly changing and evolving. Who knows, maybe one of you listening out there will become an NFL general manager one day.
Maybe.
You never know. Someone has to manage all those contracts and make sure the league stays competitive. All right, everyone, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious. And hey, maybe brush up on your salary cap knowledge. It's more interesting than you might think.